In the previous 3 lessons, we learned how to take a function and shift it around the Cartesian coordinate system. We learned about stretches, reflections, and shifts vertically and horizontally. In this lecture, we're going to take a couple examples of how we can combine all of those shifts into one problem. Okay? Let's take a look at my first example. Let's sketch the function x minus 1 squared plus 2. Now, we don't want to plot a bunch of points. We could do that, but that might take a little bit of time. So we want to figure out how we can graph this function as easily as possible. Well, let's first note that x squared is just this parabola. And that's, again, one of your library of functions. So let's take a look at our shifts here. I have 2 shifts. You might want to go back and review some of those lessons on vertical and horizontal shifts if you're a little bit, if you need a little bit of work on this. But notice I have a horizontal shift to the right 1 unit, and I have a vertical shift up 2 units. So let's write that down. I have a horizontal shift or translation to the right 1 unit. Okay? And when I tack on a number at the end of a function, I have to vertically shift it. In this case, I'll vertically shift it up 2 units. So vertically shift up 2 units. Now, it's very important that when we have several shifts going on at one time, we always do the vertical last. Okay? Let's just remember that. All right. So what I'm going to do, we're going to start with x squared. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to shift x squared to the right. And then we're going to shift it down 2. And we'll have our function. All right. So here's the first shift. Call it 1. We're going to take x squared and we're going to shift it to the right 1 unit. So there's the function x minus 1 squared. Nothing to it. And finally, we'll take this function and we'll shift it up 2 units. Okay, so we're going to take this function, we're going to shift it up 2. And there's the function x minus 1 squared plus 2. So it's very important that you know what the original function looks like. And then you can shift it however you want. All right, let's try one more example. Okay, let's try to identify the function that we're going to start with. Notice, if I get rid of all this stuff, it looks a lot like the square root function. Okay, so that's my starting point. And we know that the square root looks like this. It's kind of that sideways parabola. Now let's investigate the shifts that we've got going on. Notice I've got a 2 out here. Remember what that does, that stretches the graph. So I have a stretch by a factor of 2. Okay. I've got a negative inside the function. That means I reflect across the y-axis. Reflect, I'll say about the y-axis. I also have a negative out in front, which means I reflect about the x-axis. Now again, you might want to review those lectures, the lessons in lesson 3. And let's see, what else do I have? I have a stretch by 2. I have a reflect about the y-axis. I have a reflect, let's see, the reflect about the y-axis, that's this one inside. I reflect about the x-axis, that's this one out here. And then I have a vertical shift down. Okay, so there are my 4 shifts. And let's try to take this function and we'll do all these shifts to it. Okay, so let's first start by stretching it. Okay, well, that's just going to take this function and it's going to stretch everything up a little bit. Okay, I could plot points if I wanted to. All right, so there is 2 times the square root of x. Okay, so there's the first shift. Stretch by a factor of 2. The second one, the inside, that's going to reflect about the y-axis. So I'm going to take 2 root x and I'm going to shift it around the y-axis. And there I've got it. So 2, I'll say flip about y-axis. Okay, we're moving along. Now I want to reflect about the x-axis. That's this negative out in front. So it's going to take this function and it's going to flip it about the x-axis. Okay, so that's the third thing we did. Flip about x-axis. And then the last thing that we'll do is always the vertical shift. Okay, and we'll shift that down 1 unit. Okay, so we're going to take this function and we're going to shift it down 1 unit. And there is the function -2 square root of minus x minus 1. That was the fourth thing we did. Okay, now let's go back and see if we can figure out what we did. Here was the function we needed to sketch. Okay, I identified the library of functions. Okay, we chose that it was square root of x. And then we figured out our shifts. We had a multiple of 2 out in front. That stretched it by 2. We had a negative inside. That reflects about the y-axis. We had a negative outside. That reflects about the x-axis. And then we had a vertical shift 1. And we just took our time. We stretched it. We flipped it. We flipped it again. And then finally, we moved it down 1. Okay. So there's all of our translations. 1, 2, 3, and then finally, there's our finished product. Okay. You might want to view this lecture again. It is a little bit complicated. It takes a little bit of time. But remember, go back and memorize those 7 functions that we talked about earlier.